I have some intel.
Okay.
I think the league is going to expand to Vegas and to Seattle.
But
I'm fully willing to be aggregated. Seattle and Vegas will have NBA teams in the next like 5-6 years.
I know that was reported that, when revenues were down, we were looking more seriously at expansion. Yes, it's true that we actually had some time while we were initially shut down and we were meeting more often with our team to think a little bit more about it. But it seemed the consensus was certainly during a pandemic that wasn't the right time to expand, but that you should continue to consider it.
Over the past few years, we have gotten increased attention to the idea of the NBA expanding their league to 32 teams, bringing in 2 new teams to 2 new cities, allowing more players to showcase their talents, the league to amass more revenue, and more importantly, spicing up the competition. Last time an expansion draft occurred was in 2004, when the Charlotte Bobcats entered the league as a newly added expansion team. Before that, the NBA has had many expansions since the league began. Back then, it was only 8 teams battling for the championship. Since then, a total of 11 expansions have been held, raising the total team count from 8 to 30. Of course, you also have to include the ABA merger, which brought in 4 new teams with new players. Since we've had expansion drafts before, we can look at the rules and how it played out for the teams. So if the NBA did decide to expand and bring 2 new teams, where would they be? The options thrown around may have been many. Most notable cities like Seattle, Las Vegas, even Louisville and Vancouver. We will go ahead and assume these expansions will happen in Seattle and Vegas. These 2 teams are located in the West, so one team would move to the Eastern Conference to restore balance of each. This would mean either Minnesota, Memphis, or New Orleans would be moved. For this scenario, we will just move Minnesota to the east. But for new players to show up for their new teams, we would need an expansion draft. Here are the rules. The expansion draft would have to occur to that year's NBA draft. Teams can protect up to 8 players, and teams must expose at least 1 player who cannot become a free agent this summer. Pending unrestricted free agents are not eligible to be drafted. A pending restricted free agent becomes unrestricted if that player cannot re-sign with their original team. No team can lose more than 1 player in expansion draft, and teams can compensate expansion teams in exchange for selecting or not selecting certain players. Those are the rules. Which player would each team protect, and which player would be left unprotected and left to be drafted? Let's assume that this would happen in the summer of 2022, because with the way players change teams, it is absolutely impossible to predict what players would and wouldn't be available at a certain time. Let's start with the Hawks. They keep most of their core, and instead of keeping Gallinari and his huge contract, we think Jalen Johnson would be a much better option, leaving Gallinari and Knox as the 2 main players being available to be drafted. The Nets, they have many players on 1-year deals, including Kyrie Irving, which makes them ineligible to be drafted, and the only player they would leave out would be Daron Sharp. The Celtics situation is a little trickier. They have many players that are eligible for the draft, so they obviously keep their core pieces. But instead of Horford, they keep Daniel Tice, who is on a more team-friendlier deal. Besides, Horford is on a huge contract, and the Celtics would benefit from a traded player exception if he is indeed picked for the draft. Moving on to the Hornets, many players to decide from, but ultimately they decide to keep Bouknight and Jaden McDaniels. That leaves Cody Martin, Plumlee, and others available to be drafted. The Bulls don't have to worry about much, so they can protect their main guys, and the only real loss for them would be Troy Brown Jr. Cleveland decides to keep their core guys and players on team-friendly deals. Unfortunately, that means a player like Kevin Love would be available. Mavericks clearly prioritize Luka and the best role players around him. Not much of a loss if a player like Bertans or Sterling Brown get picked. They don't really get that many minutes. The Nuggets keep their core pieces, but that allows Jeff and JaMychal Green plus Campazzo to be available. Detroit gets to protect all of their main guys. The only real solid piece they lose on is Kelly Olynyk, who has not been bad this year. For the Warriors, it's super simple. All the main guys and all the young guys. That leaves only Toscano Anderson to be available, and to be honest, if that happened, the Warriors wouldn't mind. Excellent player for the Warriors this year though. Rockets are in a tough situation with many good young pieces, but also veteran players. Some on good contracts, some are terrible. Ultimately, they have to let those veterans be available. Both John Wall and Eric Gordon are included. The Indiana Pacers keep their main contributors, Dwayne Washington, Goga Bitadze, and Taylor, as those guys are now available for the expansion draft. The Clippers keep their core, only Brandon Boston as the player that can be picked in the draft. The Lakers have nobody to protect, just LeBron, AD, and Horton Tucker. But since you gotta let one player be available, the logical reason would be Horton Tucker. Grizzlies look out as they can maintain their best players in an already deep and solid rotation. Tillman and Conchar have to be available though. The Heat also have no issue picking their pieces. The only player left to be picked is Omer Yurtseven, a solid young center in the league who is just waiting to get more opportunities. Milwaukee also no issue, leaving George Hill as the only guy available to be picked. Minnesota have to part with Okogie and McLaughlin to make the rest of the guys protected. Minnie definitely got some good players and the future is bright. The Pels have a lot of players they would like to keep, but ultimately Kira Lewis, Hernan Gomez, and fan favorite Jose Alvarado have to be unprotected to let the main pieces stay put. The Knicks use this time as a way to protect their core plus get rid of the dumpster fire that they did with signing Fournier and Kemba. Maybe they can get better contributors on Seattle or the Las Vegas team. And sadly, Jericho Sims and Miles McBride have to be unprotected to protect the rest of the players moving forward. OKC, a ton of young players, so they just have to choose the ones with the most upside, leaving Maldon and Williams unprotected. Orlando have to be willing to part ways with Terrence Ross, RJ Hampton, and Mo Wagner to keep their young core put. Philly really just have 5 players to protect. It's their starting lineup. The rest are pretty much expandable, but in this case, it's Danny Green and Isaiah Joe. Phoenix are deep in a strong team, but in order to keep their top guys, they gotta be willing to part ways with Craig and Sarge. The Blazers have much less players to protect since they pulled the plug, but the main guys such as Damian Lillard, Josh Hart, and Anthony Simons are all there. This leaves Bledsoe and Winslow unprotected. The Kings have no issue picking the players, leaving Harkless and Len as the only 2 vulnerable players. The Spurs get to keep their core, but have to say goodbye to Doug McDermott and Romeo Langford in order to do so. The Raptors are a top-heavy team, so they get to keep their guys that are on the court the most. No big losses for them. Same for Utah, who potentially loses Azubik and Butler. The Wizards have many players as free agents this year, including Bradley Beal, so trying to find players to protect it's not that difficult. Only player unprotected is Ish Smith. That was a mouthful of players who were unprotected. Now we have gone through each team and what players would potentially be protective and unprotected. Let's look at the pool and see each team and who they can pick from. Bear in mind, each team takes turns in picking players and they cannot pick more than 1 player from a team. This might be tricky, guessing if teams want to take the best player available in an effort to trade and make assets, or take the guy with the most upside and potential. So this draft is purely our interpretation of this whole scenario. Taking this into consideration, this is what teams could look like. It seems that you have decent role players and young talent in there, but mostly it's pretty bad overall. Here are the projected lineups. And to be honest, I would still pick the Detroit Pistons or the young OKC team over these teams. To be fair, the expansion teams in NBA history are not expected to start off a good start. We have seen this before. The Bobcats in 04, here's their record. The Timberwolves, 22-60. Vancouver, please. Raptors when they also joined in 95, yeah, no, just not good. It has not been easy for expansion teams over the years in their first year in the league, as we just mentioned. But you have to take into consideration, expansion teams do get a high pick in the NBA draft the following year. When Toronto and Vancouver entered the league, they got picks 6 and 7 respectively. When the Bobcats joined in 04, they got the 4th pick. The newly added expansion teams could have been a chance to add great talent in this year's draft, if they do get a high enough pick. Holmgren, Banchero, Jabari Smith Jr. These are serious talents that can bolster your team and you can perhaps draft a guy that could be known as the first big player for your city. It's very special. Anyways, this was a rough simulation of how the expansion draft would work if it occurred to this day in 2022. If you were a GM, would you have protected a different player? Or if you are the management of the expansion teams, do you prioritize youth or veterans? Who would prove themselves more to you? These are valid questions, and we would like to hear from you in the comments below. But for now, that's all for us. See you next time.